They thought he was just an old security guard standing at the entrance of the store. Every day he wore the same uniform, stood in the same corner, and barely spoke to anyone, until that Friday evening when 3 armed robbers stormed into the store. As the robbers drew their weapons, everyone panicked and dropped to the floor. But he stepped forward without hesitation. His movements were so quick, so precise, that before the robbers could understand what was happening, all 3 had been neutralized. As onlookers watched in astonishment, a tattoo he had never tried to show was revealed on his arm, an insignia belonging to the Special Forces. Welcome to Best Honor Stories. Before we continue, tell us in the comments which city in the world you're watching this video from today. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be remembered, hit that subscribe button to help us preserve these valuable memories. Greenwood Market sat on the outskirts of a small town in Virginia, on a quiet street lined with oak trees. It wasn't fancy, had no glossy displays or flashy advertisements. It was just a reliable, honest family business. The shelves were always well stocked, prices reasonable, and the staff friendly. For the locals, it was like a second home. Frank Thompson stood at the entrance every day at the same time, with the same posture. At 67, with a slightly stooped stance and piercing gray eyes, he was mostly a silent man. He had been working in the same position for 6 years, never missing a day, always on time, maintaining a polite but distant relationship with customers. The locals called him Silent Frank. Some referred to him as the retired soldier, but no one really knew his past. He rarely spoke about himself, giving brief answers to questions. Even Robert Collins, the store owner, knew nothing beyond the retired staff sergeant listed in his employment file. Frank arrived every morning at 8:45 a.m., put on his uniform, checked his radio, and took his position by the door at exactly 9 a.m. Though he appeared motionless, his eyes continuously scanned the store, recording the movements of customers, the way cars parked, people passing by on the street. He registered everything. In the back office, young Mike, who monitored the security cameras, often couldn't understand Frank. Why does he take it so seriously? He would think to himself. This is just a grocery store, not Fort Knox. But he still respected him. He sensed there were untold stories in Frank's eyes. Every morning before coming to the store, Frank would sit on the porch of his modest home and drink a cup of black coffee. His eyes would gaze into the distance, and sometimes, without noticing, his hand would go to his left knee, rubbing the old wound there. He had never married. There were no photos on the walls, just a small frame containing a faded American flag and a silver star medal beneath it. Visitors were rare, mostly just his neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, occasionally bringing homemade apple pie. That day, it was 7:30 p.m. on a Friday evening. It was a cold November night, and the store was busier than usual half an hour before closing. People were doing their weekend shopping, cashiers rapidly scanning items. Frank stood by the door as always. When a black van pulled up in front of the store, Frank's posture subtly changed. No one noticed, but he slipped his hands into his pockets and slightly squared his shoulders. His experienced eyes immediately scanned the 3 men getting out of the vehicle. They wore casual clothes and carried shopping bags, but he sensed something off about their faces, a purpose in their steps. As the wind blew, a slight static filled Frank's collar microphone. He adjusted the sound, almost like an old reflex. He shifted his weight slightly forward, took a deep breath, a technique he had learned years ago, to clear his mind, sharpen his perception. One of the new customers hesitated near the registers. He looked around without taking his hand out of his pocket. The second headed toward the beverage aisles, but didn't touch anything. The third glanced directly at the corridor leading to the manager's office. Frank noticed these 3 men signaling each other, making eye contact. The 3 men entered. Frank greeted them, making eye contact. The men quickly passed by and dispersed throughout the store. Frank radioed Mike in the security room. 3 suspicious individuals, scanning the aisles. Check the cameras. Mike responded. Got it. Watching them. Mike looked more carefully at the screens. The 3 men were indeed acting strangely, but maybe they were just in a hurry. Was Frank being paranoid? Still, he trusted his instincts. Mike took out his phone, ready to call 911. 5 minutes passed. Frank tracked the men with his eyes. They weren't picking anything up, just walking around. His heart began to beat faster. That familiar feeling, That instinctive alarm, it was still alive after all these years. Robert Collins came out of his office and headed toward the registers. He saw Frank looking in his direction and smiled slightly. Frank nodded in response, but his eyes searched for the suspicious men again. Looking toward the registers, he saw one of the men pulling a black glove out of his pocket. Then suddenly, one of the men pulled a mask over his face and drew a pistol from his pocket. "Everybody on the ground, this is a robbery!" People began screaming in panic. The other two men also donned their masks and pulled out their weapons. One headed toward the registers, the other toward the manager's office. The first robber stood in the center, firing a shot into the ceiling. "I said, get down, nobody try to be a hero." Screams intensified. People hid between shelves, dropping to the floor. Store employees raised their hands. Cashiers trembled as they started opening the registers. Frank didn't move. He just watched, assessed. His eyes never left the robbers. The man at the registers shouted, "Hurry up, just the cash, move it." The one heading to the office dragged Robert by the arm. "The safes, security system, shut it all down, now." The robber in the center noticed Frank. He pointed his gun at him. "You, old man," I said on the ground, "are you deaf?" Frank calmly looked at him. "If I were you, I'd lower that weapon," he said in a steady voice. The robber laughed. "What did you say, old-timer?" "You see the gun, right?" Frank nodded. "Yes, I see it. And the way you're holding it tells me you've never had proper training." The robber grew angry and walked toward Frank. "I'm telling you one last time, get on the—" He couldn't finish his sentence. Frank's movement was so fast that no one could quite comprehend what happened. In an instant, the robber's gun was no longer in his hand, and he was face down on the floor. Frank had twisted the man's arm behind his back and pressed his knee into his spine. While holding the first man down, Frank also kept his eyes on the robber at the registers. With years of experience, he could simultaneously control one threat while assessing others around him. The robber at the registers shouted in surprise, "What the hell? Let him go." He aimed his gun at Frank, but before he could fire, Frank made a single shot with the confiscated weapon. The bullet struck the robber's gun, knocking it to the floor. The man screamed in pain, his hand bleeding. Frank had already removed the gun from the incapacitated robber on the floor. Now he was aiming at the second robber. His face showed no emotion, his eyes cold and determined. The second robber had collapsed to the floor, his hand bleeding. The store's customers and employees who witnessed these scenes were frozen in shock. No one dared to breathe. Besides the moaning of the robber on the floor and the soft sobs of a woman in the register area, there was complete silence. The third robber used Robert as a shield. "Move and I'll shoot your boss. Drop the gun." Frank, having neutralized the first robber, was now standing. His hand wasn't shaking. His face showed no concern. His eyes were analyzing the man in front of him. "I'll give you 3 seconds," he said calmly. "Release him and get on the ground." The robber was panicking. "Who the hell are you? Aren't you just an old security guard?" Frank didn't answer. He just started counting. 1. The robber tightened his grip. "I'll really shoot him." 2. Robert closed his eyes, trembling. The robber was drenched in sweat. 3. Frank's hand moved again. Before anyone in the store could take a breath, the robber's gun was flying through the air, and he was writhing on the floor. Frank had aimed precisely at the man's arm, making a shot just grazing the tendon with surgical precision. As the robber fell, Robert lost his balance, stumbling forward a few steps. Frank quickly went to him, grabbing his arm to help him regain his balance. "Are you all right, Mr. Collins?" he asked, with a rare tone of concern in his voice. Robert, still shaking, nodded. I'm fine, Frank. How did you?" Frank didn't answer, just squeezed his shoulder lightly and turned to the robber. He kicked away the man's gun, grabbed him by the leg, and turned him face down. From his pocket, he pulled out plastic zip ties, and with quick and professional movements, bound the man's hands behind his back. Within seconds, all 3 robbers had been neutralized, their weapons removed. Frank quickly called to Mike, "Call the police. 3 wounded." The place fell silent. Everyone was staring at Frank in shock. He calmly adjusted his tie, secured the robber's hands with zip ties, and positioned them safely. He performed everything so professionally, as if he had been doing this for years. Meanwhile, he pulled a first aid kit from his pocket and began treating the wounded. As he did this, his uniform sleeve slightly rolled up, revealing a tattoo, an eagle head with a dagger, the insignia of the Green Berets. After a while, people began to emerge from their shock and started moving. Some walked towards the door with shaky steps. Others came out from between the shelves to get a better view of what had happened. The staff was also slowly gathering themselves, trying to understand the situation. Young cashier Sarah looked at Frank, trembling with fear. "Mr. Thompson," she said in a shaky voice. Who are you really?" Frank smiled slightly. This was an expression they weren't used to seeing on his face. "I'm just a security guard, Sarah," he said calmly. "Now please help the customers get outside." Store manager Robert Collins approached Frank, still trembling. "Frank, how did you do this?" Frank didn't answer. He just continued checking the wounded. His hands were bloody, but his face showed no concern. Robert stood beside him, not knowing what to do. Frank, without speaking, scanned every corner of the store, as if checking for other threats. Then he relaxed, his shoulders loosening slightly. "Mr. Collins," he finally said, "please calm the customers. Everyone needs to stay here until the police arrive." Robert nodded, still looking at Frank in amazement. Okay, Frank, but you're more than just a security guard, aren't you?" Frank didn't answer. He just continued his work. It took the police 10 minutes to arrive. When they entered, the 3 robbers were lying on the floor, their wounds bandaged, hands bound, waiting for them. Frank was back at his post by the door, as if nothing had happened. The police chief quickly assessed the situation. Manager Robert Collins explained what happened, and customers provided testimonies. Everyone said the same thing. The elderly security guard had single-handedly neutralized 3 armed robbers. The police chief approached Frank in amazement. "You did this alone?" Frank nodded. "It's my job to protect this place." The police chief looked closer, noticed the tattoo on Frank's arm, and his eyes widened. "Were you Green Beret?" Frank didn't answer, but his gaze was enough. The police chief stood at attention. "Sir," he said respectfully, "I'm Captain James Miller. I served in Iraq in 2003. Frank nodded slightly. "At ease, Captain. I'm retired now." The police chief smiled. "Seems like some skills never fade." This conversation had caught the attention of those nearby. People began whispering. "Green Beret? Special Forces? Who is this man really?" As the police team took the robbers away, the chief turned to Frank. "We'll need your statement, sir." Frank calmly replied, "Of course, but my shift is ending. Could I come tomorrow?" The police chief nodded. "Certainly, sir. We'll be expecting you." As the store gradually emptied, employees and a few customers gathered around Frank. They wanted to thank him, ask questions, but as always, he gave short answers, didn't talk much. At 9 p.m. his shift ended. As usual, he changed out of his uniform, put on his civilian clothes, and quietly left the store. No one followed him, no one asked where he was going. He simply disappeared into the darkness as if nothing had happened. Walking home, memories flashed in his mind. Years ago, in Afghanistan and Iraq, that familiar feeling of being on alert as he moved through the darkness of night, adrenaline, focus, that moment that slows everything down, it was still inside him after all these years. The next day, Saturday morning, Frank went to the police station. He gave his statement, answered questions. He explained everything calmly, in detail. The officers listened respectfully. No one asked about his past. Some things were meant to be known without asking. After his statement was complete, Police Chief Miller invited him to his office. "Sir, forgive me for asking, but why is someone like you working as a security guard at a grocery store?" Frank looked out the window, didn't answer for a long time. Then he took a deep breath. "After I retired, I fell into a void," he said slowly. "I protected my country my entire life. Then one day they said, 'Okay, you've done enough.' I couldn't just sit at home. Protecting people is in my DNA. That store, those people, they're like family to me. Protecting them makes me feel like I still have a purpose." The police chief nodded understandingly. "I understand, sir." Frank continued, his voice now softer. "You know, Captain, in my last operation, I lost 4 of my men. They were all so young. I felt responsible, I still do. They didn't come back, I did. That's not an easy burden to carry. The police chief listened in silence. Having a military background himself, he understood that feeling. Protecting those people at the store, Frank continued. Maybe it's my way of forgiving myself. The police chief took a deep breath. Sir, you've saved dozens of lives. You're a hero to anyone who knows what you've done. Frank smiled slightly, but there was sadness in his eyes. Hero. I don't much care for that word, Captain. I'm just doing my job, as always. The police chief paused for a moment, then opened his desk drawer and pulled out a card. Sir, if you'd like, this is for a support group for former special forces. Sometimes talking, sharing helps. Frank took the card, looked at it for a long time, then put it in his pocket. Thank you, Captain. When he left the police station, he found a group of reporters waiting. The news had spread. Headlines like Hero Security Guard, Retired Special Forces Save Store had already appeared. Frank politely declined them all. He refused to be photographed, declined interviews. I was just doing my job, he said, and slipped away through the crowd. Monday morning, Frank arrived at the store at 8:45 a.m. as usual. But this time, something was different. A group of people was waiting for him at the store entrance. Robert, other employees, customers. They were all there. When Frank approached, spontaneous applause erupted. People looked at him with grateful expressions. Robert stepped forward, holding a small plaque. Frank, he said emotionally, we don't know how to thank you. You've been among us for years, but we never knew who you were. Now we understand that we had a hero silently standing in our midst. Frank looked uncomfortable. Mr. Collins, please, I was just doing my job. Robert extended the plaque. It read, Heroism is the ability to stand silently like a true warrior. Frank initially didn't want to accept it, but seeing the respect and gratitude on the faces of those around him, he graciously accepted. He thanked them and quickly went inside. He put on his uniform and took his usual position by the door. Days passed. As news about Frank spread, people tried to get to know him, learn his story, but as always he remained silent. He didn't talk about his past, didn't speak of his heroics. He just came to work every day, did his duty, and quietly returned home. A week later, a well-dressed elderly man came to the store. When he saw Frank at the door, his eyes welled up. The two men looked at each other for a while, then the elderly man approached. Frank, he said in a trembling voice, I finally found you. Frank's face showed surprise. Colonel, what are you doing here? The elderly man, retired Colonel William Baker, smiled. I saw you on the news. That hero security guard, I knew it was you. The two men sat on a bench outside the store. They talked for hours, about the old days, operations, friends they had lost. They had served together years ago. Baker was Frank's commanding officer. Why are you living like this, Frank? Baker asked. A man like you, we could have kept you in the army as an instructor. Young soldiers could have learned so much from you. Frank sighed. You know, Colonel, after that last operation, I lost myself. When I returned home, it didn't feel like home anymore. The sounds, the nightmares, I needed to get away. A quiet place, an ordinary life. I needed this to recover. The colonel nodded understandingly. I understand, Frank, but you seem to have recovered enough now. Frank looked around him, at the store, the neighborhood, the people shopping inside. This is my new home, Colonel, he said quietly. I found peace here. Here I can still be useful to someone. Colonel Baker smiled. You always knew what was best, Frank, but we missed you. The unit missed you. Frank smiled slightly. I missed you too, Colonel. The two men said goodbye. As Baker left, he looked back. Frank was standing in his usual spot by the door again. Silent, strong, alert. Days passed, then weeks. The news about Frank began to be forgotten. People again started seeing him as just the old security guard. But now there was a difference. Now when they looked at him, there was respect and gratitude in their eyes. And Frank had changed too. He smiled a little more now, talked to people a little more. He still didn't tell his entire past, but he wasn't completely hiding it anymore either. One day, store owner Robert approached him. Frank, I want to ask you something. Now everyone knows who you are. You could work anywhere you want. Why are you still here? Frank looked out the window, at the people entering and leaving the store, the neighborhood residents, familiar faces, Because they need me here, Robert, he said quietly, and I need them too. Robert understood. He didn't ask anything else. He just put his hand on Frank's shoulder and squeezed it. We love you too, sir. Frank smiled. I'm just Frank, Robert, just Frank. And so life went on. Frank continued to arrive at 8:45 a.m. every morning, put on his uniform and stand by the door. But he wasn't completely invisible anymore. People knew who he was, what he was capable of, and somehow this knowledge made everyone feel safer. Because sometimes the greatest heroes are the quietest ones. Sometimes the strongest warriors are those who keep their past a secret. And sometimes an old security guard standing at a store entrance is actually much more than meets the eye. Frank's story reminds us that the ordinary people we see around us might have extraordinary stories. Their silence might stem not from weakness but from strength. And sometimes true heroes are recognized not by their medals, but by their humility. Now I ask you, have you ever known someone like Frank? Someone who stood quietly, kept their past hidden, but harbored incredible strength and courage inside? Share in the comments below. Because these stories need to be remembered, these people need to be honored. Thank you for watching Best Honor Stories. If this story touched you, share it, subscribe, and help these silent heroes' voices continue to be heard. We'll see you in the next story. And if you know of similar stories about veterans who quietly served their communities after their military service, please share them in the comments section below. We'd love to hear about more unsung heroes who continue to make a difference long after they've hung up their uniforms.